Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us. My name is Jordy DeFelice. I'm a first-year MBA at MIT Sloan, and I'm the student lead for the baseball analytics panel. But you don't care about that, you care about these gentlemen over here. So it's my honor to introduce the greatest baseball panel ever assembled. And I'm going to start with, on the left here, we have Rocco Baldelli from the Tampa Bay Rays, Scott Boras from the Boras Corporation, Jeff Luhnow from the Houston Astros, Mark Shapiro from the Cleveland Indians, Bill James from the Boston Red Sox, and our moderator is going to be Rob Nyer from SB Nation. Panel will run till 2 p.m. We'll leave about 10 to 15 minutes for questions and answers. And if you'd like to ask a question of the panelists, please text ASK1, A-S-K, the number 1, to the number 37048. Or you can tweet with the hashtag SSAC during the panel. With that, I'll turn it over to our moderator, Mr. Rob Nyer. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. This is I've done this a few times over the years, but this is an amazing panel, and I'm really honored to be here. I'm going to start with Rocco. Rocco, what was your relationship with analytics when you were a player, and how has that changed now that you're in the front office?
Well, I was commenting as I was walking in the room that there are very few players that I think actually realize that anything like this even goes on. Guys from a young age play the game, and they're out in the field, and they're scraping their knees and learning how to play the game, but I don't think very many guys are conscious at the time on their path that they're being judged in certain ways, being measured in certain ways. I think they're worried about the game on the field, and I can't necessarily say that's probably a wrong thing at this point. As a former player and with this panel here, I think it's probably my role to talk about the human element of this. I'm not going to be able to say anything up here that's going to be life-altering statistically or any way to be measured. But when you're playing the game as a player, you're wary of things, and you work your whole life to perfect skills, what you think is the best, to the best of your capabilities. And when you are out there, sometimes you fail. And it's amazing that even players who are struggling are sometimes very hesitant to change their approach. How many hitters who maybe you could say aren't really performing don't really want to change? So I wouldn't necessarily sit up here and think that using advanced metrics and different ways to look at the game could specifically help every player, but if there's a willingness and an openness of the player to want to do that, I think there are no limitations to that player. I was reading an article the other day about Brandon McCarthy, and it's a recent article, and Mr. James is in the article, and he's prevalent, and he spoke with Mr. James, Mr. McCarthy, and they worked together at some point, I think, or maybe it was a discussion, just one discussion, but Brandon McCarthy's done a tremendous job, and it was probably because of his willingness to engage in a conversation that most guys aren't willing to engage in. Now, I don't think that necessarily is going to work for every player the way it's worked for him, but the possibility is definitely out there. I do think that most players, they go out and they play, and that's what they do. And I think that that's probably the best thing for most players to do, and not necessarily think about this. Being in the front office and working on that side of it now, I think that I want to think of the right way to word this. The front office members have to worry about, I won't get too specific because there's the most impressive discussion, I think, in this room, or the most fun for everyone would be us to sit up here and discuss specific examples of what we do. Now, there's a sensitivity to that because there's an element of I don't want to say secrecy, this isn't anything like that. But there's a time-sensitive nature, too, to the ways that we can use the knowledge that we have.
You can tell us. We're not going to steal yours.
Right, right. And I
Held it right here.
talking with Andrew Friedman for a little while, I said, how am I going to sit up there and discuss things that we do that a lot of people here would want to know about without actually talking about them? And he said, well, you'll find a way to do it. And I'm thinking to myself, no, I won't. I'm thinking there's no way. But we're only limited by our ideas, I think, in our front office. When we sit around for hours on end discussing every aspect imaginable of this game, we're really only limited by our ideas. We're looking for unique ways to look at the game that haven't been looked at before. And the information is there, and there's more coming. The things that we can measure and do now are they're incredible. Coming from just 10 years ago being in the minor leagues playing baseball to now sitting in an office and listening to our guys up there talk, it's incredible the number of things that can be measured. If we just have an idea of a way to define value in this game to a player, if we just have the idea, we can measure it. And if we can't, we're going to find someone who can, and in a short amount of time, we'll probably be able to measure it, and then we'll have a whole new way of looking at it. Now, also with the time-sensitive nature to it, if we feel as though there's only a limited amount of time, we can take advantage of that way that we're evaluating players, because we feel that it's only going to work for so long because other teams will start to do it, and it won't necessarily be something that we can take advantage of. So it never ends. The cycle never ends. It's always, we're on to the newer thing, and sometimes it's a matter of days or weeks or a season or 2 seasons, but other teams do pay attention to what the other teams do, and it's kind of been one of the most amazing parts, going from on the field to sitting in the office.
Bill, since Rocco brought up Brandon McCarthy, you were for many years sort of the ultimate outsider. What was it like to have the Oakland A's opening day starter come up and want to talk to you about what you do?
It's a little intimidating, particularly since he's both taller and smarter than I am, which left me relatively few options but to stand up and shake his hand. He's an extremely bright guy and a very nice man, and I'm flattered that he credits the work that has been done in our area with some of his success, which is very nice of him, but we'd never claim it otherwise.
Scott, to what degree have analytics become a big part of what you do?
Well, I think in the ingredients to make the cake, if you will, that there are a whole number of dynamics. And I think what Rocco pointed out is that when you're a player, when you first sign and you're readying for your career and you step into this, here comes the first language. It's the language of the play. And you have men who have been in this business for 40, 50 years who come to you and they say little things. When you do the skill throw, put your fingers together. When you throw over the top, separate them. Never heard that before. That's the language of teaching. Your balance as a hitter. Leading with your hands before you get your front foot down. Having that front foot down as a hitter, Rocco and I know we're beat, absolutely beat, if you don't have that done. And that's the language of the player. So you have that and many more things that these PhDs in baseball, men who speak with many different accents and many different forms of language. That's the language of the player. Then you have the language of the executive, and that is budgets. You have a business operation. You generally have an owner. I'm always trying to direct the general manager and the president to the negotiations with the owner, not with me, and sometimes successful with that. The dynamic of it always is that they have many, many concerns about an entire operation that has an economic language to it. It has a franchise value. It has an annual value. It has a budgetary value. It has a book of what they're going to do to grow their business. That's the language of the executive. And then you have the language in the middle of decision making, where you're talking about how you're going to fairly provide a skill set and achieve execution. Because when a player signs a contract, it's for a period of time, and we want to have execution of that contract and that skill set that he's going to provide for that contract period. To do that, there has to be certainly the performance of the player, and there's certainly a dynamic that's brought about the consummation of the contract. But how that contract is executed has to then do with preparation of the player physically and mentally. So then in R&D, we developed a Sport Fitness Institute. They have a language. So now the metrics that we use, analyticals we use, is to do the 180 turn and then run 10 yards. Can you do it at 27 at the same speed you did it at 21? Here's the metrics of your physicality, your quickness, your strength, all that, so that in your preparation, your flexibility, you have a set of metrics that you are applying to you annually apart from your skill set. Then you have the psychology aspect of it. I now am the rookie of the year. I have expectancy. I am now the MVP. How do I deal with that? How do I deal with success? How do I deal with failure? So then you have the language of psychology that is a component. And then you get around to the evaluation of what the value of a player is. And I believe you have a language that we exchange by, it depends on what language your general manager uses. Some have scouting histories. Some have executive histories from administration where they've risen through. Some are former players. Our job is to speak all languages. And when you negotiate with the Cleveland Indians, you're going to get some very applied metrics. And we're going to sit and maybe have a few discussions about as with any analytical tool, why or what that tool really means and where we go. We have internal analytics that we use, which we don't disclose publicly. That Jacoby Ellsbury is the best in baseball at this. We know that, but we don't discuss it. We don't bring it up in negotiations, but it has a lot to do with how we value him. And so in each aspect of this, when you're talking about execution, growing, consideration of the entire element, when you get down to the development of many of the analytics that have come to us from external sources, Bill and others, widely helpful, because you know what it generates is, it generates discussion. It generates an element like WAR as an analysis for a closer. Really? It's one of the worst tools in the world because it has to do with innings pitched. And we all know that the value of that last out, or the second to last out in the ninth inning, has great intrinsic value in our industry. On the other side of it, when you get around to starting pitchers or other positions in certain situations, valuable. So in each instance, that the measurement of the analytic, the discussion that it involves, and the other aspect of it is that baseball analytics have brought to our game an intellect and an interest and a talent base that we did not have 20 years ago. So it's brought an interest level from a sphere of people that I think will help us grow this game and help us do things at a much higher level and certainly bring us to an educational level and cause people like myself 15 years ago to hire an MIT graduate, to hire a NASA engineer to write language, and to do those things, because along the way we've had instances where we want to do the best job at creating the truth. And the truth and the best for the game is that value. And I think that the development of analytics and the discussion and panels like this really, really help us in many ways create a system where we have an exchange, a common language that everyone feels comfortable with. Because in the end, when you do things in this game, if everyone can answer why they did it, if everyone knows the why, regardless of how they got there, I believe they feel they're treated fairly.
Well, you mentioned the why. I think you suggested that you have internal metrics that give you a value for every player, but you won't reveal the why when you're negotiating. What is the value of knowing that if you can't tell the why to a general manager?
I think the aspect of when you have internal metrics is that you go to them first. You go to them first because they reveal a lot to you. They're not necessarily a part of the final equation. But for example, we have metrics that help us evaluate bat speed, because I want to know the bat speed. How do I predict the bat speed? They have all kinds of scientific metrics about that allow analytical studies of golf swings, baseball swings. But I really want to know the component of bat speed for a hitter, so I can say to him, regardless of age, I know I can put, if a player comes to me and he's 36 years of age, and he says, do I have you negotiate my contract at 34, or do I wait till I'm 36? I'm going to need to know the first thing about his bat speed, because he's a hitter.
Can I ask you a question, Scott? What do you do when you find that that the general manager is placing a significantly higher value on your player than you are?
He's happy.
Other than celebrate.
You know, the funny thing, Bill, it happens almost 95% of the time. I just pick up the phone and say yes. It's that simple.
That's not what I've heard about you.
5% the thing.
But you know that it's that instance was actually something that there's a variable that's going to happen, because in baseball, the magnitude of the need for a specific franchise and the whole that you've had to observe, when you're a general manager and you have to observe something 162 times, and the pain of that and the loss of it, and you know that there's someone out there that may fill that need, but that person is good at filling that need in that place or in that division, and you have a good idea, or you're almost sure of it, that he will not do well in that particular place with that particular staff, and the way he's used by this manager and the way he's going to be used by this manager, the reality of it is that you're going to, in most instances, guard against it, except for one time. And that is when the interest of the player's family and the need for him for the caring and that of his personal needs outweigh the interests of a lesser interest of how he's going to win or potentially perform.
Jeff, you recently signed on to rebuild a franchise that lost 106 games last year. And I know this is maybe a tough question to answer without getting into specifics, which you can't do to a large degree, but how do you use analytics to differentiate yourself from all the other clubs that are rebuilding, or some of the ones that aren't rebuilding and have the same sorts of people doing analytics that you do?
Well, first of all, I'm delighted to be here, and kudos to Daryl and Jessica. This is impressive. This is my first time here, and what a great conference to be a part of. So appreciate you all inviting me. Before I get to the Houston question, I want to talk about St. Louis for a second. I spent the last 8 seasons with St. Louis, and there's no question that sports analytics helped the St. Louis Cardinals win the World Series last year. And I know that sports analytics has helped other teams in the past, but I just wanted to make it clear that what's happening, what everybody in this room is excited about, the reason we're up here, the reason this whole conference exists, it is taking place out there. And to different degrees in different clubs. And like Rocco said, we're not going to sit up here and share our secrets, although our industry in particular is one where you probably could share your secrets, and only about a third of the teams would probably decide to even implement it or copy it or read it. But we have to be careful, because everybody's looking for an edge. And what I'm excited about in Houston, when I came to St. Louis in 2003, St. Louis did not have much with respect to analytics, and that was my first job, was to come in and figure out what to implement and to implement it. We're now 9 years later in 2012, and we have a clean slate. There was not a lot being done in Houston before now. We have alignment from the very top all the way down, which is key to getting anything done in an organization. And there's so much more, like Rocco said, specific, valuable information available today than there was back in 2003, that to a certain extent, having a blank slate is a huge opportunity to gain an edge. Because in 2003 with St. Louis, we began to design the database and the architecture and how we're going to profile players and how we're going to integrate the scouting information with the analytical information, with the medical information, and all of those pieces have evolved substantially since 2003. And so to be able to start with a clean slate, I think is going to be pretty exciting. I think when I look forward, there's been a tremendous amount of work both done by people in this room out there, experts, as well as clubs in player evaluation and trying to predict how many runs saved a pitcher's going to deliver or how many runs a player's going to deliver. The frontier from my perspective is really turning that player evaluation into player valuation, because that's what I care about. When Scott and I have a conversation about a player, this player may be 12 runs above average and another player may be 10 runs above average, but there's so many other factors that go into whether I'm going to be willing to pay more for that player or less for that player. And just to give you an example, one would be we always talk about here's the most likely outcome for this player, plus 12 runs. Well, but what's the distribution look like? Is there a 10% chance that he's below replacement level? Is there a 10% chance that he's well above superstar level? What does that distribution look like? Because two players with the same average could be very, very different in terms of how I value them and how Scott might value them on the other side of the discussion. And so I think there's a lot of talented technical people in baseball these days. More and more, I think we're going to start to see some MBAs. And I personally have an MBA in St. Louis. There were 2 other MBAs besides myself, one of whom was on this panel last year. And all 3 of us had technical backgrounds, engineering undergrads, and then got an MBA. So we were able to bridge that gap. But it's really, what does the distribution of player talent look like at the big league level? Is it a normal distribution? Does it get cut off at one point? What does it mean? You have to start thinking about, do we develop a Black-Scholes model for talent? I mean, these are very much like stocks. They're speculative investments. What's your appetite for risk? How do you value that given the risk? And I think all of that stuff is going to be exciting for us in Houston to set up, and we're going to be, I hired about 10 people initially since I got there. 4 of them were geeks, nerds, computer guys, including one guy that I had with me in St. Louis, and they're wonderful. Also hired the cheerleader from Harvard that was written about. So we're starting to collect some interesting people. I also hired some baseball people from various clubs, but it's fun because now we're in a conference room, whiteboard, trying to figure out how we're going to do this. And it's not, there wasn't complete alignment in St. Louis in 2003 when I got there, and nor is there in a lot of organizations. But to be able to drive it from the top down and have buy-in from ownership and be able to take advantage of all the technology that's out there, I'm looking forward to it, and I think that ultimately will get us where we need to go.
Well, this is a bit of a digression, but we talked about this last night a little bit. What's it like, and this is a question for really any or all of you, there's a certain body of knowledge out there now that anyone can access, all websites, et cetera. So those of us on the outside tend to think we know, if not everything, a lot of things. And what is it like for you inside when you make a move that might not make sense to the rest of us on the outside, even though you have the same, you're looking at a lot of the same numbers we are, but you make a different move and then you read on the web, we thought this guy was so smart. How could he possibly make this move? And I know Jeff, you've had that experience very recently, and I'm sure you have as well, Mark.
It's frustrating because you wish you could tell the fans everything that went into the decision, but you go on Fangraphs and you read stuff about the player, and if that's all the information you had, you might make a different decision. But you've got a lot of information from the clubhouse, from the player, how the player reacts with other players, his behavior, et cetera. you got medical information, you have a lot of other pieces that are relevant that you really can't discuss, and you're going to be second guessed no matter what, so you just have to take it and move on.
I mean, I've always felt in the communication of those decisions, which is certainly one of the greatest challenges, and obviously for multiple reasons, most importantly the factor that Scott discussed, the human side. You often can't fully explain your decisions. I think consistency and honesty that you can't explain the full reason for a decision is what works best. In the end, these are not jobs where you want short-term approval ratings. These are jobs where you want to be right, and the full evaluation of a decision often takes 4 to 5 years to determine whether you're right or wrong. So you got to believe in what you're doing. You have to be consistent in your execution of it, of your strategy, and you got to be respectful of the human element, which is ultimately, I think, something that's very important to talk about in this group too. There's still an art to it, and it's still human beings. They're not assets. They're still human beings.
I recall the same writer in Detroit, and Mike Ilitch and Dave Dombrowski had signed, after a 119-loss season, had signed 2 or 3 players. A couple had been my clients. And 3 years later, they're in the World Series. At inception, the writer, these must be, someone must have pictures here. The broad shoulder theory, really a difficult moment, and you are taking it at a time you've just lost. Your team is woeful. You're the worst in the league. And so you suffer these attacks. And then 3 years later, you're the executive of the year. The same writer is writing about the genius of the building of this process.
Short-lived genius.
And so I think that, not to in any way bemoan the journalism profession, the best available thought process by the journalist and the supportive reasoning, I think, is what I look to. And certainly there's, for all of us that are in decision making, there might be a few negative things written about you. And the reality of it is it supported? Is there a logic to it? Knowing that basically executive decisions like players, they're in play. And until there's execution with the theorem, not only on a singular sense, but a broader sense about what a player means to a team. Because a player could perform at an average level, but grow 3 or 4 other starters. He could be a 500 pitcher, but yet be the person that pitches 1 on the staff. And then those other pitchers develop under him. And they're saying, you paid this much money for a 500 or less than 500 pitcher when he fulfilled the expectancy of the general manager and the staff to its fullness. And so a lot of that is, I think, a process of looking at the analytics of it, portray signing that innings guy to be the number 1 as, why would you pay him at that level? Yet the result years later is that we don't have the component of value over time plus development of players plus the process of understanding that our goal is to increase our winning percentage annually to this level. It's always looked at that moment.
The other thing I'd say is, getting back to a combination of what Jeff said earlier, or an offshoot of that, Jeff's job, my former job, you get more free advice, and most of it doesn't come from the quality of advice that would come from this room. Most of it comes at the barber shop, when you drop your kids off at school, when you turn on the radio in the morning, when you pick up the paper. And what I would say, that it's a swirl of emotion that can affect, emotion and momentum can affect decision making. And that's where maybe the MBA and the strategic comment comes in, because if you've got objective analysis that helps pull back the emotion, and you've got framework or strategy that people like MBAs that can help provide you, then you can maintain some consistency and protect yourself from that emotion, momentum-based decision making. Because ultimately, when you're making those decisions that are emotion and momentum influenced, you don't chart a course, you're basically reacting, and you never stop reacting.
If I could add one thing to that, it does sometimes happen that there's a momentum outside the decision makers and a momentum inside the decision makers, which are running in exactly opposite directions, and you get a kind of tornado, where the the public desperately wants you to do one thing at a time that your coaching staff really, really, really wants you to do the other. That's a tough one.
It is.
Rocco?
I think there's a tremendous amount of trust that also, when you're dealing with unique ideas and doing things differently, that has to take place between all levels of the hierarchy within an organization. And if you have people conflicting all the time, it doesn't necessarily work as smoothly because without putting words into the mouths of everyone with the Rays, I think it's safe to say that our ownership group and our general manager and our on-field staff work very, very well together. And when you're doing something that might not necessarily be the most publicly accepted thing, but all of those three groups are working well together and agree on it, then it works. Then it doesn't matter. And we have people who don't necessarily want to be not hated in the media, but if we do something that we think is right and nobody else seems to agree with that, as a group we're okay with that, and we smile and maybe joke about it a little bit and think it's funny, but we have a reason to believe why we think it's the best decision. But without that trust between all those groups, I think you can end up in a tough spot.
And that synergy is observed on the outside, because I know I sent a player to the Rays specifically because that dynamic worked. And I knew Joe Madden had the relationship with Andrew, and I watched Joe Madden develop players when he was a coach in Anaheim. And I sent Carlos Pena there at a time in his career where he needed a system that offered what they offered. That support, that unity, top to bottom, and the player flourished in that dynamic.
And May again. Mark, I believe you've been to the Indians since 1991, is that right?
Yeah,
So you're top man in seniority here when it comes to the front office. Could you talk a little bit about how analytics have evolved in those 21 years now?
Yeah. So not to date myself, and Scott and I were joking about this before, but the role of objective analysis and the confluence of technology. I remember sitting in John Hart's office, in 1992, making trades with stat books, probably Bill's books, open on our laps, and scouting reports being pulled from a filing cabinet behind John's desk. And our technology was an Excel spreadsheet that I did, a history major from a liberal arts college. So, you talk about the progression from there to where we are now and the understanding of the quality of analysis is available, but to me, really the intersect of data, analysis, and technology. Because one without the other doesn't do any good, right? You've got, the amount of data available, and I was talking to Keith Woolner and some of our folks, so the Statistical Digest, if that was one unit in 1992, and that it was all put on, it was all qualified in megabytes or gigabytes, and that was one unit, the amount of data from PitchFX and, ball and play would be 800 times that. The amount from our HD video would be 2.5 million times that. So you've got to manage the data. You've got to then put it in a framework for making a decision. You've got to have someone that's intelligent to analyze it and provide someone who's not that intelligent like me the ability to make a decision from it. And so I've seen that progression. It hasn't happened instantly. It's happened over time. The understanding of the value within a decision. And I think as important is that ultimately the decision is about getting the best information possible. Some of that is objective analytical information. Some of that is still makeup, character, personality. Some of that's medical, something that doesn't get talked about, which is an absolute separator in decision making. Some of that's still subjective analysis from men like Scott talked about that apply a language that's been honed over 50 years of watching the game. And then there's still an art to making the decision. There was an art for John Hart making a decision in 1992, and there's an art for Jeff Lunau making a decision now. Because you've got to determine how you weigh all those different variables. Because no machine's ever going to spit out an answer. It is not going to spit out. There is still an art to making a decision. And the beauty for me has been transitioning to club president, staying involved with Chris Antonetti on the baseball side. And now I'm talking about pricing strategies and market segmentation and some of the business analytics. And it's the same thing. It still doesn't spit out an answer. This is how you price, this is how you segment your market and market. It still spits out a lot of great ideas that a lot of people who have experience, intelligence, who understand people and players still have to apply to making good decisions. No one makes them right all the time, and I don't think anyone ever will. But you want to make, like getting back to Jeff's analogy or Jeff's expression, you want to make sure that you're making the most important ones right more than the teams you compete against. And so all decisions are not created equal. That ability to prioritize which ones, where you deploy your resources, the framework, how quickly you can get information, the quality of that information, that's what's changed. We never thought about those kinds of things. Now we have a constant thirst for the best input across that whole realm, not just the best objective analysis, the best scouting, the best medical, constant thirst, give us the best information that we can, and we have, that's the front office life, is you live with an unending thirst for better information all the time to help you make better decisions.
You know, it's often said that if you sign player A, you'll sell X more tickets. Is that part of your equation now?
It's more now than it was before, but I'm careful on that. I mean, it's not that hard, and I know Scott and I would disagree on this, and it's his job to disagree with me on it. But you know, we can obviously do very easily look at per caps. You can look at how attendances are impacted, and there are ways. And we've had conversations with Scott in small hotel suites where we've talked about it for hours, just more intellectually. You know, there are ways to look at the value added for a player beyond wins, beyond attendance. The offshoots are numerous. It'd probably be interesting to hear Scott talk about that. But you know, I think that is a factor. But I tend to, in Cleveland, I think it's a factor that is different in different markets. In Cleveland, I think we weight more the value to winning than we do on the marketing impact. It's a conversation that will be had, as Bill was referring to earlier. You're going to discuss that, but that's not going to be one of the major inputs into a decision.
Next question is for Bill, but I'm going to have a follow-up. I'm going to tell everybody what it is so you can prepare. I'm going to ask you in a minute for one thing that you don't know about baseball that you would like to know. But first with Bill, I'm going to ask a little more general question, which is, what is the next frontier for baseball analysis?
Yeah. I'd say there are two things that are most obvious. One is that most of the information that we have about baseball players is about major league players operating in a major league competitive environment. But most of the information that we need is about players playing in other places, and playing in college, or playing in Japan, or playing in AA, or playing in a half-organized league somewhere. Most of the information we need is from those other places. We have no real concept of how those levels of competition fit together. If we say that a major league competition is at level 1, is AAA at 0.98, or is it at 0.8, or is it 0.7? Is a good college program at 0.4 or 0.6? Or we really don't have a clue. One of the things that we most need to understand better is how those levels of competition fit together, and so that the information that we get from one level can be interpreted at another level in a way that is more helpful. A second thing I'd say that is a critical area of research yet to come is what's good for the enterprise. Changes in baseball and changes in any sport and changes in the economy are almost entirely driven by people and teams and individuals doing what is in their interest, or if you want to call it that, in their selfish interest. And very often, what is in the interest of the team or the player is powerful in terms of changing the product, but not helpful. An easy example of that is the batter who steps out holding up the game to gather his thoughts. Well, it's obviously helpful to the player. I mean, you don't want to be standing up there, you know, in any way, shape, or form a confused state of mind. You know, it's helpful to get out of the batter's box, clear your head, gather your thoughts, and make sure you're focused before you put your other foot back in. From the standpoint, I mean, but think about what it would do to a movie if a character could hold up the product for 45 seconds before delivering his next line because he wanted to be focused before he delivered that line. It does the same thing to a baseball game that it does to a movie. It slows it down and makes it less interesting, and it causes a lot of people to think that baseball is slow and boring. What's happening with the alignment of colleges in the NCAA is another example of what I'm talking about. The colleges are doing what is in their own interest in jumping from conference to conference and pulling out and realigning the television arrangements. They're all pursuing their own interest, and they're changing the landscape by pursuing their own interest. But it's not really in the interest of the enterprise as a whole for all of this stuff to be happening. So the big frontier in research is how do we work for the enterprise itself rather than for studying what works for the enterprise itself, for the sport of baseball or for the sport of football or whatever it is, rather than what works for. Most of our research has been what works for an individual, what works for a team. But we also need to learn to look at the bigger picture.
Mark, would you like to know that you don't?
I mean, that listening to Bill talk reminds me how little I know. I mean, I would say I can't. So I started instantly trying to prepare for that answer when you asked it. And what struck me is every single day that I get on any one of 10 websites or pick up something and read it or walk down the hall and talk to, Keith Wilner and Jason Perret and Sky Andrzejczyk and guys in our analytics department, or pick up the phone and talk to Chris, or talk to someone, about from Procter & Gamble about market segmentation. There's an infinite number of things that I don't know. And I think it's sorting through what things we need to know quickly and find out in a time frame where they're still relevant to know them. And just in a leadership role, making sure that we have someone else who does know it within the office. But I can't focus on one thing. I can think of a bunch. I came thinking about vision, thinking about the medical side, thinking about different things in the baseball side that I've always wrestled with my whole career. But I think I can tell you, Jeff will tell you, you wake up every day and you read something, and you immediately think, is somebody on this? Are we behind? That happens. That's the life. Right? That's the life you're living, right?
That's right.
Jeff?
Okay, I want to know what's going to be the first team from Texas to win the World Series. Also, as an experiment, I mean, we're not going to do this, but it would be fun to take the 10 people from this crowd, the 10 brightest people, and just give them publicly available information, nothing that we have as insiders, and give them a budget, which is basically the minimum times 25 players, and see how many games they would win. I think that'd be a fascinating experiment.
Scott?
A higher level of results and probability to the assumptions you've created. One of the things I think our business is really, really been deficient in, that I think lessens the probability of, these, I think, and Rocco, you'll agree, when you play with players and you're on a field with them, and all of a sudden you see a player who's a great player. And you're always a kid, you're kind of always the good player, and then you go to college, you're still a good player, then you get drafted, you go, and then you get to spring training, and then all of a sudden there he sits. And then there's 2 or 3, and they are extraordinary. They are the gift. And then when you're involved with these kinds of men in their lives and you see that they have these gifts, you want the execution of that skill, of that athleticism. You want that to be what it should be. You want the probability to be the highest, because that's what makes the game great. The most intervening factor is the psychology of the player. And one of the things that I was so fortunate, and we just lost him a few months ago, was Harvey Dorfman, who worked for the Oakland A's, and they were a great winning organization. He worked for the Florida Marlins, and they won a world championship as well. And fortunately, I was fortunate enough to have him work for me for 20 years. And I learned so much And the bridge of this information should be collective, sponsored. We should be training psychologists to understand our game, understand players, because the old story of a great athlete being hot and then being cold, and yet we know the talent of these men. How can they be cold? How can they have this skill and yet be so grand for 10 days and lost for 5? And those dynamics, I've learned that the consistency of performance has been those players who've taken on the psychology and is in addition to all the physical and technical merits of what they do. And in baseball, having men who are gifted at doing that and delivering that and getting self-understanding for players, that would be the question that I'd like most answered.
Rocco?
First, for what Scott just said, I had that moment as a young player, and I stepped into an instructional league clubhouse at the Raymond Nemoli complex in St. Petersburg, Florida, and Josh Hamilton was sitting next to me, and then we went on the field together, and I knew he was special when we took infield together, and he walked out to the wall and picked the ball up, and he threw it from right field to third base on a nice long one hop from the 345 sign, and then he proceeded to hit several balls over the batter's eye in center field. And that's when you see things. When you see things you've never seen before, you admire it, and you really, really appreciate it, even as a player. As a former positional player, the thing that I spend a lot of time on every day is why some people hit and some people don't. And you can look at it mechanically, you can look at it statistically, you can pore over every piece of information that you can gather, and I think the question still looms at the end of the day. And every time you think you find a way to prove something, you can find a way to disprove it. And I found, especially being able to work and go see a lot of amateur players and then seeing our minor league system a lot, it's the question of who in the future is going to hit. Because once guys show that they are productive offensive players with the bat, generally they become too valuable for you to acquire, and you hope that those are your players and your players are becoming those types of players, and then you have them. But the question of why some guys or how some guys develop offensively as players, and someone who spent 12 years of his life trying to perfect something that seems it's impossible to perfect. It's something that I've always been enamored with.
I wanted to ask everyone basically a question about the draft, because there's been some talk about an international draft, and there's some evidence that a draft actually depresses the investment in that area. For example, Puerto Rico, maybe the best example, where we haven't been seeing as much talent from Puerto Rico. And I'm curious to know what any or all of you think about the idea that if we have an international draft, for example, the Dominican talent, which has been so productive, might go downward, which might save money for MLB, but leads to a lesser product on the field. Scott, you want to start with? I'm sure you have some thoughts about the draft.
It's kind of funny how people always come to me about
Yeah,
talking
I know,
about the
sorry.
draft. Yeah. I believe that in baseball, and from being trained as a young entry-level player of pro baseball by George Kissel, and being around the Cardinal scouts, and then being in the field I'm in now and watching scouting, is that these men are really good at what they do. They're really good at assessing talent. And I believe there are 64 high school players right now that are in the big leagues making $5 million or more, and 47 of them were drafted in the first couple rounds. Not a surprise. So, and that's taking talent at its youngest level. And I know in the draft process, when you go to a general manager or an organization, an owner, a scouting director, and you're talking about millions of dollars, and I've been in this business a long time, I would say less than 20 that we've asked for $5 million in 30 years of doing it. Because it's just rare that you're going to ask a team to invest that type of money in that type of player. And the percentage is 100% of these players are in the big leagues all doing well. There's, granted, some are superstars, some are really good players, but the return was always there because the players are that gifted. So when we look at draft, the important thing in baseball is our product, and that our scouting industry has access. You know, baseball's fortunate because every athlete in the world, the greatest athletes in the world, the first sport they play is baseball because they all play Little League from 8 to 12. And yet we release them to other sports after that because we lose track of them. And we have to resolve that issue in youth baseball. We have to make sure we're tracking these players from 12 on, so they don't leave baseball. They have association with it. The next step of it is, though, is that in how we allocate our resources, I think the draft, like any draft, is bad business. We should not spend a lot of money on players in the draft. We should not. But we should have a system that has the flexibility for organizations to allocate their resources appropriately, so that the fun of baseball, or the necessity of intellect in baseball, is that you have behaviors. For New York, the Yankees, with their television contracts and their rights structure, to go out and be a development team, I don't think so. They need to have a winning product every year, and therefore they need to have a free agent approach. And you have Tampa Bay, who have a strong development approach. Cleveland, a strong development approach, where they're going to go out and they can't afford to retain major free agents, but on the other side of it is they can do things. We have to have the freedom, so if they want to spend double the money of the Yankees in the draft, so be it that they're allowed to do it. They trust their scouting and development. And so anytime you put restrictions on that behavior and on that intellect, because the other thing is that talent comes in clusters. It never comes just in the distribution. Like Jeff talks about distribution, same thing comes in talent. You have drafts, like we had a draft a year ago that was very deep. It might have 30 players in it. And then you have a draft like this year that has less than that in it. And all of a sudden, the fact that a club may want to spend double the money one year and half the money the next, I want those teams to have the freedom to do that. And when we have structures like this, we have taken the hands away from a general manager and an organization and their intellect and scouting by giving them this rigidity when the talent pool suggests that the better intellect is to have the freedom to spend as they see fit.
Yeah, we're pretty aligned with, I mean, we've talked to Scott, Chris has, and I've talked to him historically about it. We're coming from very different places, and I'm not sure that I would articulate it the same way, but I you know, and this is where I definitely wrestle with what Bill talked about earlier, what's best for the industry and what's best for the Cleveland Indians. It's very hard for me to take my Indians hat off. So I believe, you know, like Tampa, and like I know Jeff will, but I know that, and we spent more time talking to Tampa probably than anybody else about the draft, you know, that, you know, you need to allow for that deployment of intellectual capital at the time and actual capital at the time when you think it's most advantageous. And we have such a finite amount of resources, we need to be able to deploy it where is most appropriate at any given time. But an underlying challenge that exists is the combination of MLB's construct on a collective bargaining level with market size and revenues. You know, it creates some extreme imperfections for someone that's trying to operate and wants to win. And so, you know, there are conditions that within that side of me that want to see not necessarily, and I never wanted to see a limitation of where money's deployed, but I did want to see a disproportionate allocation of talent. Not just an equal allocation of talent. I wanted to see a disproportionate allocation of amateur talent. Because the one thing I can tell you is never going to change in the foreseeable future is a proportionate distribution of talent in the free agent market. So that, you know, if you really want to give people the chance to truly have a legitimate hope and dream opening day in all 30 cities, you know, somewhere there's got to be some breaking point to create something other than just cycling. And so I know that wasn't necessarily what you were going at, but I can't help but think about the draft system and the allocation of amateur talent and what great organizations like Tampa Bay do with it and Houston will do with it. And I can't help but think that's got to play into everything else in the way we look at the allocation of talent in general, not just amateur.
Yeah, if we had draft measurements that were allocated for parity, that the Cleveland Indians would, because of their economic circuitry, would get 2 picks in the top 10, and they can spend their money as they will. My point is the limitation, because the unfairness of structure is that it deviates from intellect. And we want the men who are operating these franchises to be accountable and also to have the freedom to utilize the resources of these unique men to make the best decisions. And because the fractionalization of talent over an age group is so variant, you cannot say that one draft to the next is the same and the allocations and deployment of money is the same. Even if they said you get so much money over 5 years.
And even more so the step between the third and the fourth pick.
Oh, exactly.
I mean, that's the greatest misperception. I mean, it's not, I don't have to tell this group, of all groups, but that's the biggest challenge. The people that design the system don't factor that in necessarily.
If you win with winning and development, you know what your reward is? You pick later and you have less money to continue the development.
Amen.
So now here success is not repetitive, it is penalized.
All people who have studied economics know that when governments attempt to regulate markets, it always creates a misallocation of resources somewhere, right? Anybody who studied economics probably knows that. The new draft regulations are not only a regulation of a market, it's an extremely heavy-handed and rigorous regulation of a market. There's no question that it will create a misallocation of resources somewhere. My guess is it will work very well for the first 7 or 8 years, and then a bubble will create somewhere and the system will break.
Jeff, what do you think about, the impact of an international draft on, say, the talent level in the Dominican Republic in the future?
The Puerto Rico story has been talked about. I think there's a lot more to it than just Puerto Rico becoming part of the draft. Baseball's not cool in Puerto Rico like basketball is and some other sports, and I think that was probably a bigger driver than, there weren't as many Puerto Rican players that the kids looked up to and wanted to be major league players. I think that was probably a bigger driver. Dominican, if you look back, Dominican Republic's an incredible country. I mean, produces more baseball players per capita than any country in the world by far. And if you look at what scouting was like there 10, 15 years ago, you were able to sign a player there for $5,000 that we would have to spend 50 to 100 to get in the US. That's changed. Now it's almost inverted. And we're going after these kids that are 15 years old, and we're giving them, millions and millions of dollars, and there's no limitations at all. And we've seen it with stuff the Rangers have done in the past couple of years. They have a big TV contract, and they're spending like drunken sailors in the Dominican Republic and all over Latin America. Is that fair? I don't know. I do like the fact that there's going to be some limitations, and I think also like the fact that MLB is getting more involved in that market. It's not like you go there and you watch college games or high school games. You go there and these kids showcase, and the representative of the kid won't let them play in games sometimes, or won't even show them to you sometimes. There's a lot of games going on behind the scenes. You can't even get access to some of the top talent sometimes unless you're a notorious spender like the Rangers or the Red Sox or somebody like that. I think MLB getting involved and having showcases and being involved in leagues and making sure that the players are who they say they are, they're the age they say they are, and they're not taking any performance-enhancing substances, I think that's all good. And my only complaint is that the Astros should have more money to spend internationally this year than anybody else, and we all have the same this year. And back to Scott's comment, I just need this draft to be one player deep.
Theo thinks he should have the most money to spend this
Yeah,
year.
I'm sure he does. But I do think, you're right. Anytime you have government, I'm a free market guy. Anytime you have government, creates some inefficiency. But at the same time, the goal is competitive balance. And it wasn't working before when kids were getting drafted in the 12th round and being paid $2, $3, $4 million by teams.
Whose goal is competitive balance?
Well, that's the stated objective, one of the stated objectives of MLB.
I think the defining competitive balance, I'm still waiting for that definition.
But if that was part of the goal with the new CBA, I think they closed up some loopholes that were there before.
And maybe most importantly, protected some young men that, you know, moved towards protecting some young men that have been exploited historically. And, you know, hopefully, I think some of the steps you mentioned are at least starting to protect some of the players that have been exploited for so long from from some bad people.
On that note, we're out of time. Thanks to all of you, and thanks to our fantastic panel.